Hey everybody, welcome to the Educators Talk Show by Being Different. On this show, we invite educators from all across the globe to talk about ideas in learning and education. The goal of this show is to introduce learners and educators to these ideas so that they can take their learning and teaching to the next level. Today on the show, we have with us Mrs. Preethi Vickram, who's the founder of Tapas Progressive Learning and Leadership Initiative for Educators, LIFE. Inspire, nurture, and transform are the three attributes that define her professional journey so far. She's committed to making a difference in the lives of children and consequently the world at large. Today, we will be talking about the ideas in STEAM curriculum and how it's a great way to align to the objectives of new education policy. Let's dive deep into the conversation right away. So, since you've been in the education industry for a really long time now, why do you think experiential learning is essential for our children and for us in general?
Right. So my long years in the field of education, I've spent most of it with children in the early years, that is children below the age of 6, 7 year olds, right? But what I see is that learning is the same across our entire age of studying, being professionals, running a business of our own, whatever phase of our life, learning continues to look and feel the same, right? Um, I believe that experiential learning helps us to remember much better because we are learning by doing. And so, in effect, when we talk of experiential learning, it means that we are involving a lot more of our senses. Ayush, if I ask you, what are the senses that anybody has? How many can you count?
Five
You would
senses.
say five senses. But let me tell you that we don't have just five senses, which we all typically have been taught, but we have seven senses. So, our seven senses, including the five that we all know, will be the additional two will be proprioceptive sense and vestibular sense. Okay, so proprioception has to do with a lot with understanding the space around us. And so, if, for example, I have to jump or leap, how much do I have to bend so that I'm able to propel myself forward? Right? So, proprioception is understanding the space and dimensions around us. And that's a sense that develops in children and as you grow into adulthood. The other one is vestibular sense, which has a lot to do with balance. It is about if I have to maintain balance, what is the position of my head with respect to the rest of my body. So this is a sense that is also getting developed as we are growing. So what I'm trying to say is that if learning is experiential, our five plus two senses are all getting involved. Now, imagine if I'm just sitting and learning by looking at somebody talk about it. You're maximum using your visual sense and your auditory sense, maybe a bit of the kinesthetic or the sense of, the feeling when you're writing it down. But beyond that, there is no other senses that get involved. Whereas if I am physically involved in the learning process, if I'm learning by doing, then my hands are involved, my body is involved, my mind is involved. And so experiential learning leaves a longer impact on the learner itself. And so, my really favorite quote is that children learn best on their feet and not on their seat. So you have to get up and do. If you're sitting down, you're not going to be learning much. So, when you look at experiential learning, it means that the learner is actively engaged in the learning. It means that you're thinking about how to learn, what to learn. You're consciously making a decision about what will be my next action, or how am I going to process this. So that's a very conscious, it's an engaged learning, as opposed to your traditional means of learning where you are learning while somebody is again, I go back to the same example of somebody standing in front of the classroom and talking about it. There you just become a consumer of information. So there, you're not engaged in that conversation, you're not thinking about those things, and hence experiential learning tends to have a more lasting impact on the learner.
This is very interesting because most of our lives we've been sitting in classrooms listening to a teacher, and then now when I see more of these education initiatives that are emphasizing more on experiential learning and actually learning by doing, I think this is a great step to enhance our learning, especially of our children who are just stepping into this world. So,
Absolutely. And taking that a bit forward, I feel that especially children are robbed of the vestibular and the proprioceptive sense when we make them sit in a classroom for so long. Because when you're sitting on the table and you have the sitting on the desk and have the table in front of you, these two senses hardly get developed. And so these are the children who grow up to have a lot of health issues later on in life. A lot of movement issues come in, and there is a correlation between the children having learning disabilities with the amount of proprioceptive sense and amount of development of proprioception, and as well as the vestibular sense. If that is lacking, children tend to have learning difficulties. So if you're looking at the number of children who have trouble with handwriting, simple example of handwriting, by the time the child has come to fourth grade or fifth grade, the teacher is always complaining that the child has bad handwriting, or the number of children who are having that issue has risen over the years. And the simple fact is that they are not climbing enough trees, they are not jumping off enough compounds, they are not doing as much as we used to when we were children or our parents were children, right? So our senses are not developed, and because of that it's impacting what we're doing in the classroom. So it becomes cyclical. If the child is not writing well enough, then they are given more writing work, so then where is the chance for the child to go out and experience things? So it's a cyclical process which is making our children more and more unaware of themselves and their bodies. And so it's important that we get up and move a lot more, play a lot more, and experience learning a lot more.
I think that's a very interesting thing that you pointed out, especially the development of the two other senses, which usually not a lot of people talk about. And I read it somewhere, this quote: as our body moves, our brain grooves. So, with the movement also comes the development of our own brain, and and that also aids in our own learning process. And with the advent of technology and mobile phones, I see a lot of small kids stuck to their phones, sitting in their homes and doing literally nothing, not moving around as much as we used to suppose as we supposed to move, right?
Oh, don't get me started on screen time of children. I think
Uh-huh.
that's something that I'm is so perturbed by nowadays, because I think that many parents look at giving a gadget to a child as a nanny, right? I'm waiting in the car, I'm waiting at the bus stand, I'm waiting to eat my food. Give the child a gadget. So the interaction is much lesser. Research shows that language is developed by a two-way communication,
Mhm.
but your apps and today's games, everything will lead you to believe that just because you play 10 rhymes a day, your child's language is getting developed. So it's much contrary to what the app developers will lead you to believe. But that's a discussion for another day. I'm
Yeah.
digressing.
So when we talk about learning and education and development in children, there's this term that comes across a lot, which is called STEAM education and STEAM curriculum. What do you mean by that?
um, so STEAM stands for science, technology, engineering, art, and math, right?
Mhm.
Also, unfortunately, in the last decade or so, we have been led to believe that robotics and coding is STEM curriculum or STEM learning, but it's not really limited to that. In a sense, when you look at STEAM, it stands for a multidisciplinary learning. It stands for when learning is not contained in silos, like you have one period of science, one period of engineering, one period of math, and things like that. So learning doesn't happen that way. STEAM, when we talk about learning, it's completely multidisciplinary. It stands for learning that is driven by the curiosity of the child, right? So when we are working or in our real lives, I don't think learning is, or our performance is compartmentalized. I'm talking to you while I'm able to do math, while I'm thinking of the way technology is assisting us. So I'm not drawing a clear line that I'm only going to do math in the next half hour, I'm only going to do science in the next half hour, right? So when life is not like that, why should learning be compartmentalized? So, giving you a small example, um, in school, say in I think about eighth grade is when you learn about the concept of sound, right? In which class did you learn about sound?
Seventh, eighth, that was the time that I learned about sound for the first time in my physics textbook.
In your physics textbook, right? And usually that's how it is taught also in most of the boards of education. They will put sound under physics because there is a sound wave and it travels through xyz, and this is what the output is and things like that. So if we teach a child that you're learning about sound in a physics classroom, they're always going to think of sound from that perspective only. But once I introduce that this is how sound travels, or this is the what sound is made up of, um, say if I extend that learning and say we use it to measure a child's growth through an ultrasound. Sound is used in an ultrasound machine.
Oh.
I use it underwater to
Mhm.
measure the distance through a sonogram. I
Mhm.
use sound in my instruments, whether it's a percussion instrument. I use sound when I'm speaking.
Mhm.
Now, is sound limited to the physics class? It's
It's
not.
not.
It's not. So why should we teach children in subjects? So I believe that the minute you remove the whole compartmentalization of subjects, learning becomes unlimited. The child can explore sound from how many ways? I'll give you another example of STEAM. Say you have to learn about the circumference of a circle. Do you
Mhm.
remember the formula for circumference?
Yeah, I think it was 2 pi r, if I'm not
It
wrong.
was 2.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. I think it is 2 pi r too. But so the reason why we probably remember a little bit and probably don't remember it so well is because
Mhm.
we've never really applied that in our real life. Correct?
Right.
About it. At Tapas, what children do is they're going to have to make a plate for having their lunch in. Now, if I have to make a plate, I need to
Mhm.
figure out how much space do I need for my rice or chapati, how much
Mhm.
space do I need for my sabzi or rasam or sambar or palya. All these things have to fit on my plate. So,
Mhm.
how big should my plate be? I'm going
Mhm.
to learn about, so this is how big my plate should be. I'm going to draw it on a piece of paper. And then I'm
Oh.
going to use that to make a plate with actual clay. They're going to make a
Oh.
plate, and then we have a in which they will bake it and
Mhm.
then take it back to their lunchroom and then have lunch on it. And so, was their estimate correct? Did they
Mhm.
really get it right? Now, when I have applied circumference concept in this manner, will I ever forget it? The whole understanding of STEAM is that if math has a meaning, has a context, it's learned better. So when I'm wrapping learning in STEAM,
Mhm.
it's holistic, it's contextual, it makes sense. So I hope that answered what STEAM is.
One of
Again,
the
I
interesting observations that I had while you were talking about compartmentalization of subjects was when I was in school, everyone used to ask me whether I want to study science, commerce, or whether in science I want to study biology or mathematics, right? So my entire school life has been compartmentalization of subjects and studying subjects by what society wants you to most of the times, right? And then when I graduated out of high school, I realized that I'm curious in a lot of multidisciplinary fields, which don't, I mean, if I were to study all of that in school, there wouldn't be a curriculum for that because they are too separate of fields to study. And then when I realized that I am curious in a lot different things, I realized this thing is also related to this thing in a different way that people usually don't talk about.
exactly. Right. So you got that realization, and that's fantastic. And which is probably why you're hosting this kind of a show, because you see that there is a need for it. Right. So,
Mhm.
and unfortunately, many people live their lives without that realization. They believe that, okay, if I'm an engineer, I'm supposed to know only this. So I think that's the barriers we have to break for ourselves. But I'm hoping that with the new education policy and with the revolution that education is going through today in
Mhm.
India, we are able to break these barriers for the children of the future at least.
So we talked about STEAM education and what it is and why it's essential. What do you think are the development that goes in a brain, in child when we have STEAM curriculum as its first experience? Like we're using STEAM curriculum to educate a child.
Right. So if you look at it, children are born curious, right? They're born scientists. A 6 month old, you give them a toy, they'll drop it to the floor because they want to see what's happening with it.
Mm-hmm.
They'll pick it up, they'll put it in their mouth because they're trying to amass as much data about that particular object as they can. So they are little scientists. A 2 year old, you break off a piece of chocolate and you say one is smaller and the other is bigger, and you offer it to them. Are they going to pick the big one or the small one?
The
Definitely the
big,
big one.
the big one.
Exactly. So, did somebody give them a math lesson on big and small? No. So, they are born curious and they're born very perceptive. Children are born that way. We kind of educate them into getting out of these habits. So,
Mm-hmm.
if we continue to allow them to be curious, if we give them the right tools with STEAM, you're developing the processes of observing, thinking, hypothesizing, guessing, estimating. These are the processes that you're developing in children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we allow them to continue with this kind of thinking, I believe that there is no limit to the children's potential. If you look at Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, it talks about children having multiple areas of intelligence. It's not just IQ. So there are,
Mm-hmm.
eight intelligences that he talks about. Um, if we allow children to learn in this manner, I think that the 21st century skills, which is your creativity, curiosity, collaboration, and critical thinking, these will be developed really well in the children. As they grow older, they are going to develop these four skills. Because when you're learning in a multidisciplinary approach, you have to communicate your ideas, you have to defend your thoughts. At Tapas, one of the ways that children actually learn is through debating. If I have to learn about a concept, I come back into the classroom, make a presentation to the rest of my class. The other children are going to ask me questions and debate with me. I need to know enough to substantiate what I'm thinking, and hence my communication is developed, my critical thinking is developed. So what I'm trying to say is that children, the essential skills are developed in children. Now, the 21st century skills, what I mentioned, this was a report that came out it was a report from World Bank, which talks
Mm-hmm.
of employability and what are the skills that is required by people who are being employed. And according to this particular World Bank report, subject matter expertise or the academic knowledge came 19th. And
Oh.
so, your companies like Google and the Apples of the world have already started having recruitment practices where they're no longer looking at what is the qualification of the person. I think they're all moving into aptitude and skill based testing rather than qualification based.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are the skills that are needed in the future? So that's where the World Bank report talks about the top four skills being creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. These four skills are going to be very well developed if you continue following this approach of experiential learning, of multidisciplinary learning, which is what STEAM stands for. So I think um, it also makes us conscious citizen, don't you think so? When you're not looking at subjects, when you're not looking at learning only for the sake of writing my exams. My learning is because I want to contribute to the society. My learning is
Mm-hmm.
because I can add value to what I'm doing, and add value to the problems, in resolving the problems, right? So it makes us conscious about what we are really doing in terms of our learning. And I think that's the best part of having children go through this form of education.
One interesting thing that you said was, uh, amongst a lot of other interesting things, that children are born scientists. And I was remembered of this quote, I think from Picasso, that like everyone is a born scientist. The only thing is to like remain one while you grow up. And that also reminded me of how I see public speaking. I think every child is born public speaker. It is something that is conditioned out of us. I mean, don't you remember a toddler crying out loud when it was like 2 years old in front of 100 strangers? And it had no sense of what it is to be fearful of public speaking. And then it starts to question, and it starts to ask a lot of why questions. And there are people who say, okay, this is the reason, and like they don't really feed their curiosity, right? And that just makes them to form meanings all the time, and that conditions public speaking out of them most of the times.
You're right, and young children are not do not have much inhibitions. Yes, they do. Sometimes there are some children by nature who might not want to come up and
Mhm.
talk, but they are more comfortable expressing with others. But you're right in terms of inhibition. Children don't have it. They are going to just say things and sometimes embarrass the adults around them. But then that's how children are, and I think if we manage to make sure that they don't lose that, we've done half the job of educating them correctly.
Mhm. So, with the advent of the new education policy, also, what do you think? I mean, what are the um, recommendations for pedagogy for NEP?
Sure. Um, so when the national education policy that came out in 2019 and then which was implemented in 2020, um, it's for me a very beautiful policy. It has a great vision, and I just hope that it is implemented in the right manner. Because I'll tell you what excites me about the national education policy. First thing is that early childhood, which was till now not considered to be under the education department, it was till now considered to be under the Department of Women and Child, right? So this policy says that early childhood has to be under the education department. That itself is a landmark move, which makes
Wow.
sure that the practices in early childhood education are much more standardized in terms of what should the child be learning at the end of it. Because today, more and more schools are putting more and more pressure on our youngest lot to learn faster and
Mhm.
academics faster. So I
Mhm.
think it kind of puts a halt to these practices, which impede the growth of the child. The second thing is, for the first time in the history of independent India, play is given a lot of importance in education. And so that's so exciting, I can't tell you, because
Yeah.
um, uh, when the vision document of the country says that let children play more, there is no better way of ensuring that our children are learning, right? So
Mhm.
play has featured in the national education policy. Um, Thirdly, I love the way that they have defined the stages of development. They have kept in mind how children's brains and cognitive development takes place.
Mhm.
So they have ensured that the first 8 years of life is called the foundation stage, and then the 3 years is the preparatory stage, and then 3 years is your middle school, and then after that is your secondary education, which is 4 years. So you see that they have divided it into 5, 3, 3, 4. That's how the
Mhm.
education has been
Mhm.
divided into. Um, so when it comes to pedagogy, what the national education policy talks about is in the foundation stage, it should be play based and based on discovery. So play and discovery will be the pedagogy of education right up to second grade is what the policy defines. From
Mhm.
the third grade right up to the sixth grade, what the policy says that we build on these, that is play and discovery, but bring in a little bit more structure. In your middle school, which is your seventh to ninth, there you're going to have a lot more structured learning coming in, which is concept based. Again, they are differentiating from subject based to concept based, right? So they talk about concept. And in secondary, the focus is on vocational training. The focus is on skill building, because if a young adult wants to stop his education right after 12th grade, he should be skilled enough to go out and get a job, because a large population in India might not be able to afford higher education. And
Right.
so, when this child is moving out of schooling and going into the real world, are they skilled enough? So, these have been the major focus of the national education policy when it comes to school education.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also very excited that higher education also has been dealt in a very um, uh, new manner, new to India at least.
Mm-hmm.
What you mentioned earlier about having had to choose between science and commerce and arts, so that barrier is being removed. The national education policy talks of how there will not be any streams of education anymore. There will just be
Mm-hmm.
courses which the student can choose to major and minor in, so they can choose the subject. So I might be majoring in Bharatnatyam, but I might also be studying economics. So
Right.
that's the kind of flexibility that the national education policy has given, which means that there is lesser stress on the student in school education. So automatically, as it percolates down, the stress levels are coming down. So I think these are the points that I'm really excited about the national education policy, and I hope I answered your question on pedagogy that has been defined there.
Circling back to what we talked about, STEAM education, why do you think, or do you think that STEAM education will be a good fit when it comes to implementing NEP's policies?
I think it's the perfect fit because so STEAM education can take multiple uh, mutations. I mean, because that's the word everybody knows today. It can
Mm-hmm.
mutate into a lot more things. So STEAM can become STAMP. STEAM, if you're including physical activity into it. STEAM can become STREAM, because if you're looking at reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is the
Mm-hmm.
R in STREAM, so that can so it can mutate into a few other combinations of letters. But
Mm-hmm.
in essence, what it means is that it will be multidisciplinary, and that's the specific word that has been used in the national education policy in terms of how learning should be.
Mm-hmm.
The national education policy says that learning should be flexible, because the curriculum has to ensure that it's flexible, and also that it has to be integrated. It says that children shouldn't have to go through just one or two subjects. So multidisciplinary, flexible, integrated, these are the words that you see often being repeated in the national education policy, and these three words define what STEAM curriculum also stands for. So I think it's a great fit for
Mm-hmm.
educators. If they are able to implement STEAM based learning at their schools, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure they will automatically align towards the national education policy.
I think that will be really great if we get to see more of STEAM education in our schools in early childhood years. That will really develop the way we uh, develop our child's learning and how school education evolves ultimately. Do you, I mean, I had a last question. What do you think is the message that you want to give to educators in terms of how they can implement more of STEAM education in their curriculum, how they can use the concepts and principles of experiential learning to develop their curriculums and build classroom experiences that actually make students learn better?
Right. I think two big recommendations, what I feel will help us to transition from where we are to where we should be. Two big recommendations. One is that we do not look at assessments as uh, being a final exam, like a pen and paper
Mhm.
test. I think that if we break down the culture of judging a child on that 3 hours of time that he has given to write a paper, we are able to allow the child to learn as they want. Right, so we
Mhm.
have to break that the whole concept of summative assessments and have more of formative assessment, which means that if the child is playing in the classroom, can we observe the child and then assess how much they've learned instead of waiting till the end of the year and judging them based on those 3 hours, like I said. So at least till the seventh grade, if we are able to allow children to learn and not judge them on and have summative assessments, I think we are able to structure learning a lot better.
Mhm.
Have more formative assessments would be my first recommendation. I think the second thing I would like educators to adopt a lot more is to have blocks of learning during the day rather than subject wise periods that the day is broken up into. Have blocks of learning where we can allow multidisciplinary learning. So the challenge that most schools face is that they say that no, but how will a science teacher and an arts teacher work together? So we have subject matter experts. How are we going to make sure? I think it's a great chance for the science teacher to learn a little bit of arts or the arts teacher to learn a little bit of science. So have blocks of learning, have both the teachers available for the child at that time. Why can the teachers and the facilitators not learn with the children? We don't know, let's learn together should be the attitude. So the second recommendation would be to have blocks of learning through the day. Have a 1 hour block instead of saying I'm going to have 2 periods of one of science and one of arts or one of English and one of geometry. So just have 1 hour where they are going to experiment, they are going to think, they are going to do things with their hands, and have about 4 5 blocks in the day of this kind, and allow for a lot of reflection. Children should be able to come back to the teacher. The teacher becomes a facilitator, helps them understand, okay, so this is what you observed, do you think it can be like this? Ask a lot of what if questions. What if this was different? So it just opens up learning rather than keeping it to that one textbook which goes in a linear manner of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. So just break those things down is what
Mhm.
I would say is the right way to learn.
That is very interesting. I think very helpful also. One thing that really concerns me though is that with the coronavirus and the pandemic, we've seen that we can be at homes for a year, right? And we can stay at home, and like our education can be like massively disrupted this way, which makes me think that parents' role in education and in educating their child is very crucial, right? What advice do
Yes.
you have to the parents when it comes to, especially in the early years of education, what advice will you have for parents?
Oh, the parents are a poor lot of people. They have to juggle home, they have to juggle work, and then now they have to juggle with the child's learning as well. So I really empathize with the parent community this year and going forward the next year as well, because there's just a lot riding on their shoulders. Um, I think children, irrespective of what environment they are put in, will learn.
Mhm.
Just that we need to provide them with the right resources, especially in the early years. What's stopping a child from learning, say, shapes in the kitchen? I can go along with my mom or dad into the kitchen, and while they
Mhm.
are cooking, I can learn how a triangle becomes a circle while making a chapati.
Right.
I can learn about the sounds that the objects are making. So I believe, especially in the early years, a lot of learning can happen if the children are allowed to participate in everyday activities. Also, I feel that um, parents find it tough to include children into daily life, like whether it is to get the child to fold their own clothes, set the table, and simple things like that that can be done with the child in the early years. Um,
Mhm.
Conceptual learning will happen if we have conversations, if we are open to learning together. Like I told with facilitators earlier, I think parents also should learn to say, I don't know, let's look it up. Teach them about looking up in the right manner. So um, for parents, there are two things that they should be doing in the year going forward. One is that ask the right questions. Second is answer the questions that are being asked correctly. So when it comes to asking the right questions, um, I think again it's in our DNA to ask questions which have a closed-ended answer, which is like correct answer. Ratava answer from the textbook, right? That don't ask questions which will give you those answers. Ask questions which will make the child think and go out and learn a lot more. Secondly, if the child is asking you questions, I mean, I've heard of stories where, if the child asks, where does rain come from? There's a funny answer of somebody pouring water from the sky. And so I mean, try and answer them as realistically as possible if you can. And if you don't, then learn together. Take it as an opportunity to learn together. But most of all, I think the biggest thing that parents need to remember is don't feel guilty if you can't. That's all right. It's perfectly fine. Children are not so. Um, um, I believe in neuroplasticity that you're going to continue learning. So it's not so critical that children have to learn this year only. They can learn this year, they can learn next year, they can keep learning throughout their life. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do anything about how badly or how well the learning is going.
Mhm. I think that is very insightful and a very well crafted advice for parents, and that is very helpful, I guess. Um, and thank you so much for like coming together and giving really insightful talk on how we can use STEAM education in our curriculum for educators and some advice for parents as well. I think this is very essential to talk about things like these because a lot of times we don't understand how we learn and how our children learn. And just by knowing how our children learn, we might be able to design experiences and change questions accordingly so that they learn better. And I think this was a very insightful talk for that, I am assuming.
Thank you so much.